Welcome, everyone. I'm Jim Rogers, and this week we'll be discussing supply chain management and the effects that supply chain disruptions are having on the construction industry. All right. Hello, everybody. Again, I'm Jim Rogers. Thank you for joining me today on my weekly Thoughts from the Field live stream. As always, I'm going to start out with a couple news and event items. The big news this week, I think, has been in modular construction. And one of the things that I've seen happening, which has been wonderful, is my modular construction course has really kind of blown up on LinkedIn Learning, and it's gotten a lot of views and follows and likes, and I really appreciate that. Hope everybody is enjoying that course. It was a really fun course to make, to see how the industry is really modernizing and pulling some of the things that we used to do in the field into the factory. And I think it's really relevant to today's discussion because it really changes how we manage the supply chain as construction managers. And we're gonna get to that in just a minute. Let's pull this off here. One of the things that I think has caused some of the interest in modular construction this month is we have this great big announcement by Warren Buffett where he and one of his construction companies are really going to jump in and quote, offer a fresh approach on modular construction, or that's what Architecture Magazine says, Architecture Digest says. But I think that that's really driven a lot of interest in the last few weeks towards modular. Unfortunately, we've also seen yesterday, Wonder Kid Katerra is shutting down. So this was one of the big modular construction companies that started a few years ago that I think has really struggled to catch hold in the industry. They bought a couple of other construction companies and have continued with traditional stick building type of construction. But they announced yesterday, you can see here in this news outlet and several others, that they are shutting down. Which is really unfortunate because I think that prefab and modular has a lot to offer. Not to worry because, again, even though Katerra is shutting down, we have plenty of companies like Warren Buffett and his new company, and then Digital Building Components, which is the company that I worked closely with to help film that modular construction course. All right, so that's my news. That's my modular news for the week. The last bit of news that I have is just a reminder that next week is the construction industries and perhaps all industries' first big live trade show since everybody has been shut down during the pandemic. We have World of Concrete coming to us next week, June 7th through 10th in Las Vegas. Little bit smaller than the typical show, but still about 650 exhibitors. So I'll be excited to tour that on Tuesday, and then Wednesday, June 9th, I'll report back to you all on anything new and interesting that I find. And regardless of what I find at World of Concrete itself, I'm really excited, like I said last week, to go ride some Teslas through the 1.7 mile tunnel that Elon Musk and his boring company constructed under the Las Vegas Convention Center. 1.7 miles for about $47 million, did it in a year. Really phenomenal construction statistics there. So I'm excited to ride that and kind of report back to you on that as well. All right, so this week I have a guest with us, share his information to you here. All right, so this week I've got fellow LinkedIn Learning instructor Daniel Stanton joining me. Daniel is an expert in supply chain management. He has multiple courses on supply chain management in the LinkedIn Learning library. He's also the author of Supply Chain Management for Dummies, which is a pretty popular book and publication out there. He also has, if I can find it here, a newsletter, a weekly newsletter that you can see here on LinkedIn that he was kind enough to feature me in this week. talking about supply chain management in the construction industry. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about today. So I want to bring him on here and welcome Daniel. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Jim. Thank you so much for having me, and hi to everybody out there. Thanks for coming and hanging out with us to talk about construction supply chains.
Yeah, so we started talking about this a few days ago. We did a clip or two for the newsletter, and we talked about some of the supply chain disruptions that have been really impacting the construction industry. To me, it's kind of funny because I don't know. I think I met you a couple years ago. We were doing some LinkedIn Learning courses, and like supply chain management. That's your thing. You talk about the supply chain all the time, but all of a sudden in the last year, everyone's talking about the supply chain, right? What's happening? Why is this such a buzzword all of a sudden?
It's hysterical because in the supply chain world, the running joke has always been, it's nobody pays any attention to the supply chain people, right? We're like Rodney Dangerfield. How come we get no respect? And then 2020 and continuing into 2021, the spotlight is always on us. And so it's sort of like, okay, that was nice for a little while, but we kind of missed the old days where it wasn't all about supply chain. But the truth is we are surrounded by supply chains, all of us, every day, right? We don't think about it often. We don't take it, we kind of take it for granted unless that's the lens that you view the world through, which is my case. I can't help it. It's like, what was the movie Sixth Sense where, I see dead people, right? For me, I walk around and I see supply chains. And they affect us personally, and they affect all of our companies, right? Any product or service that we consume, that we purchase, that we sell, has a supply chain that it depends on, right? And so just real quick, I'll say, when I think about a supply chain, what do I mean? How do I define that? Well, it's a complex system, really, that's made up of people, processes, and technologies. And that system has to be engineered and it has to be managed to deliver the things that we value, right? And that's been the challenge in the last year especially, is there just all kinds of things affecting the people and the processes and the technologies that make it hard for those supply chains to operate.
Do you think that we've sort of I don't know, I'll say we as the general population, the answer is probably yes, but do you think we as the construction industry have kind of taken the supply chain for granted? Like do you, I don't know that I see a lot of construction managers that are really involved in the supply chain and watching the supply chain, again, until right now when all of a sudden it's impacting us. Should we be, as construction professionals, as construction managers, should we be doing something different? I mean, should we be watching the supply chain like you watch the supply chain?
Well, of course, the answer is yes, right? And I'm not going to point a finger at the construction industry for having done anything, particularly egregious, bad, or wrong. I mean, none of us were paying attention to the supply chains for toilet paper, right? And then all of us suddenly got this lesson going, oh, okay, maybe I should think about having some safety stock and how long that could last me and what the impacts would be if I have an out of stock. Mm-hmm. So I think, Jim, the answer is absolutely yes, that, we can't, no matter what business we're in, we can't automatically assume that the future is going to look exactly like the present, right? And so if the present is, I can buy all the materials I want and I know how much they're going to cost more or less, well, I mean, that's okay until it's not, right? And supply chain management really is about, okay, so how would I know if that's going to change? How would I prepare for that? How would I respond?
And can you give us some examples? Like how would I know if that's going to change? So we've got like lumber. Lumber seems to be really disrupting the construction industry now. Certainly, if you're building, single family homes or 3-4 story multifamily wood frame construction homes, that's our main building component. And we've seen prices just skyrocket and availability just, sort of bottom out. was there a way to, I guess, foresee that or plan for that in the future?
I mean, yes and no, right? But you know what? One of the things that we see a lot of times when we look at the world as supply chains is there's this dynamic called the bullwhip effect, right? And what the bullwhip effect looks like, if you think about a supply chain, we'll use the supply chain for lumber. So there's a consumer at the end of the supply chain, right? Which is, probably a homeowner or a developer, or the construction company, maybe the construction manager, right? For the developer.
Mm-hmm.
But then you work your way back through, certainly whoever is distributing that, right? Whether it's commercial construction material wholesaler, right? Depending on the side, or it may be Lowe's or Home Depot, right? Depending on where you're buying your stuff from. And then you go up to the sawmill, and you go up to the loggers, and you go up to the trees, right? The source of the supply chain, or the beginning of that supply chain. Well, what you see in the bullwhip effect is that supply chain gets out of balance. And so you may be at a place where on the retail side where it's getting consumed, there's no inventory available. But it would be perfectly it would not surprise me at all if right now the lumber mills are running at full capacity and building up inventory and buying up timberland as fast as they can, or the rights, right? And so, instead of the supply chain being sort of a smooth flow where you make one, you sell one, you make one, you sell one, instead you have huge piles up of inventory in one place and you don't have anything in another. But what's interesting is that bullwhip moves through the supply chain. So where you have a lot of inventory today, in a couple of months, you may have no inventory. You may be stocked out there, but then, a couple of steps down the supply chain, you just see like this bubble move, like an egg going through a snake, right? So I think that's what we're seeing today in the construction industry is a bunch of this turbulence, a bunch of these bullwhips that were actually triggered by this really radical drop that we had in February, March, April last year, right? And so if you have a really sharp and fast drop, that triggers one of these bullwhips that just moves up the supply chain, and then it's going to keep moving back down. And it just takes time for that to stabilize. You need to get rid of the disruptions and allow things to return to a steady state. And anything that happens in the meantime that's another kind of crisis or disruption is just going to restart the madness.
Yeah, and I got a question here. How I'm in Arizona, so one of our listeners, our viewers here, how does the construction industry in Arizona State look like? And that kind of plays right into what you're talking about. We are booming here. I mean, it is, we're building like there's no tomorrow, and we're starting to see some of these supplies used up. But yeah, Arizona didn't have much of a drop off during the pandemic, but we had a little one, and other states in the country had a drop off. So, overall, we saw the construction industry drop off, but now it is just skyrocketing. And I had some statistics up last week from AGC that showed construction industry statistics and activity around the world. Compared this year compared to last year, and we're just skyrocketing, and so now we're starting to use up some of these materials as fast as they're producing them, and then I don't know, just to sort of tie everything together in this weird supply chain conglomerate, I guess, is the fact that in the construction industry we can't buy any pickup trucks right now. Right. Like if you want to go buy, the Ford F-150, right, the most popular construction truck out there, and you go to a dealership right now, they literally won't even show you one. They just laugh and say you can't get one right now. We don't even have one. We got some used ones,
Right.
But new, forget about it. And that's all because Ford can't get microchips for the trucks.
The semiconductors.
So we have that's to me that's kind of an interesting study in supply chain management, right? If I'm a construction company, if I'm a trade contractor, and let's say I find the skilled labor and I hire them, and now I need to put them in trucks and start building up crews. I can't buy any new trucks because there's a shortage of semiconductors. That's crazy.
It is absolutely insane, but the same thing, right? So this is one of those bullwhips that was triggered by COVID. So,
Okay.
you know, the semiconductor industry has just become tied into every supply chain these days, right? It's, you know, automobiles use them. The other one is home appliances use semiconductors.
Interesting.
Well, semiconductors are made in what they call fabs, fabrication plants, multi-billion-dollar factories. We have a handful of them in the U.S. Actually, Intel has several of them down in your neck of the woods around Phoenix. But the truth is, most of that manufacturing happens in Asia. Mm-hmm. When COVID hit, like everybody else, you know, those plants either slowed down or shut down.
Okay.
And it, you know, if you thought about it sort of in real time, okay, you know, probably people aren't going to be buying as much, and we can kind of shut down the factory at the same time. But what gets left out of that equation is the lead time, the lag between when you would make a semiconductor and when you would consume it, right? You know, you put it into the component in the vehicle, and then you sell that component to the manufacturer who assembles the vehicle and eventually gets to the customer. So what we're seeing is probably the length of that supply chain is about a year. It takes about 12 months from semiconductor to automobile.
Yeah.
The other one that from our conversations, my wife is in real estate. And one of the big issues there is, you know, if you're a builder, in order to complete the sale of your home of a home to your customer, you need a certificate of occupancy. Mm-hmm. In order to get the certificate of occupancy, everything in the house has to work. All the utilities have to be working, and all the appliances need to be installed. So we had a place around the first of the year where the appliance manufacturers couldn't get semiconductors. So you couldn't make a stove. You couldn't, and if you can't get a stove, you can have a house 99.9% done, and you can't close. And so for the home builders, this became a really, stoves suddenly became really, really valuable.
Wow.
And it plugs up the whole market. Like you're saying with the trucks, for folks that are in the trades, you're like, well, if I don't have a truck, I can't get to the job site, right?
Yeah.
Right. For home builders, if I don't have appliances, I can't sell a house. For a home buyer, if I can't move into my house, I can't move out of my old one, right? Yeah. I can't sell my old one to somebody else. And so it just clogs up the whole flow, right? The whole market because of silly things like a semiconductor. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish.
I was going to throw one other thing in there. So, you know, when you're looking at a job site, right, you're really focused on the direct materials, right? Like the lumber and the concrete and availability and pricing there. And then, you know, I would put pickups, for example, into the indirect space, right? Yeah. You need it, but you don't need it just for that job. You need it to be able to work overall.
Sure.
But one of the challenges that we've been facing in the supply chain is so much of the stuff that we use in construction and other industries is imported. And we've had all of these transportation disruptions. So one that everybody saw in the news was the Ever Given, the container ship that clogged up the Suez Canal for a week.
You had some great posts on that.
Right. But you know, it wasn't just about that one ship, which, by the way, that ship is still sitting in the Suez Canal.
It's still stuck, right? And all of its cargo is still impounded, right?
That's right. It's all still there. But there were about 20,000 containers on that ship. So you can imagine, more or less 20,000 companies
Yeah.
that were counting on material that they still don't have. But there were probably 1 million containers on either side of that vessel, right, on other ships that got held up for a week. And then, that creates huge problems for the port, right? You've got nothing for a week, and then all of a sudden they all show up at once. Well, the ports can't operate that fast. I see my buddy AA is joining us. That's great. I can't read the question. It's too small. But the one other thing I was just going to say about the containers is, you don't think about it. So you're thinking, oh, I can't get pickup trucks for the job site. Well, what a lot of the supply chain folks are dealing with is they can't get containers to put stuff into to even import or export it because they're all in the wrong places. So we've got these bullwhips just in all different parts of our supply chains right now.
So do you think that bringing that semiconductor conversation back around full circle, what we're seeing specifically in Arizona is all of a sudden we have Taiwan Semiconductor, a huge manufacturer overseas, announces this multi-billion-dollar investment in Arizona, and they're going to build, starting right now. I mean, they've already broken ground. Starting right now, they're going to build brand new fabs in the U.S. in Arizona. And then as if in response, Intel, also announces, oh, well, we're going to continue to expand out here in Chandler too, our fab capacity. So eventually we get a lot more domestic production. Do you think the supply chain becomes a little more predictable when you start to remove elements? So like if I remove overseas shipping, do things start to get a little more predictable?
Yes and no. So,
okay.
One of my friends is a professor at MIT. His name is David Simshi-Levy. And David has done, a lot of work on supply chain risk and resilience. And, one of the points that he's made specifically about semiconductors in Arizona is moving the manufacturing location doesn't eliminate the risks to your supply chain.
Okay.
It just changes them, right?
Okay.
So, now maybe we're not as vulnerable to some sort of a disruption in Taiwan if we've got domestic capacity, but fabs use a lot of water, right? What if Arizona doesn't have the water available? What if, there's something else happens in Arizona? So it doesn't eliminate the risks, it just changes them. Overall, I mean, I tend to think about it a whole lot like, when we talk about, buying stocks and bonds, you want to have a diversified portfolio, right?
Okay.
And the whole point there is to try to manage those risks. The other thing that I'll say, though, about the semiconductors in particular, I think it's great that we're increasing domestic manufacturing capacity. I'm all behind that. I think concentrating it in one region like Arizona actually creates some other risks. There are benefits to that, but there are risks that come with it too. The other really important point, though, is that it still isn't enough capacity to keep up with the growing demand for semiconductors. We need to be building fabs everywhere.
Should have been starting this like 3 years ago.
Exactly. And I've heard one estimate that we need 20, not 2,
wow.
just to keep up with, sort of current and anticipated demand.
So do you think that, with the spotlight on supply chain management in the last year, do you think that my industry, I'll say my industry, engineers, architects, contractors, construction industry professionals,
concrete experts, Jim,
and concrete
experts, yes.
Do you think that we've learned anything? I mean, this whole thing is fascinating to me because it does go all the way back to the architect and the specifier. If you're building this great, fabulous building with all these cool finishes, and you're specifying products that the contractor's not going to be able to get, it's really disruptive to your project. And it is something that if you pay attention to, I feel like in the planning, in the pre-con phase, and you sort of look at some of these things and ask, am I going to have trouble getting this? Maybe if you do it at that phase, you can substitute materials, you can plan for things, you can say, well, maybe we need to start buying these now, even though I don't need them for a year, because looking ahead in a year, it might be a problem. But if we don't do that, we get to, okay, we're ready to order this material, this finish, this truss joist, this whatever. Guess what? You can't get that for 9 months. That's really a problem, because now you've got a developer who's got all this money out there. They've got a construction loan. They're paying interest on it. The job slows down. So I don't know. Do you think people have learned this time around that we need to start paying attention to the supply chain?
So I don't know how to tell whether people have learned, right? It's funny you say that, because my newsletter last week was talking about lessons learned, right?
Okay.
And
yeah.
An observation is not the same thing as a lesson, right?
Sure.
And in order for it to be learned, you actually need to do something different in the future. So I think we'll have to wait and see. I will say, for me, construction is just a form of manufacturing, right?
Sure.
And whereas, I've done a lot of work in continuous manufacturing, right? So making automobiles, making tractors, electronics, those sorts of things, right? Where you've got an assembly line and you're making multiple units of each one. That's a process. What's different about construction as a manufacturing business is its projects, right? There's a defined beginning, there's a defined end. Everyone is kind of unique. In the product manufacturing world, what you're describing is this change in mentality and approach. We call that design for supply chain, right? So at the point of the product designer, at the point of the architect, how do you think about ways to build in flexibility? Maybe around raw materials or components, maybe about around when and where you manufacture things. So modular construction, for example, could be a way to give you more flexibility and design for supply chain. The trick is, it's true in the product manufacturing world, and I'm sure that the same applies in construction, is that the designer has to understand what comes next, right? They need to be able to communicate and have an understanding of the downstream supply chain processes, or else they can't incorporate that in their designs, and they can't account for that. So like in any other supply chain, I think, a big part of the key becomes communication and collaboration and transparency, right? Being able to have those conversations of, hey, what's happening right now on the ground? What's impacting our supply chain? Can we feed that information back and adapt the designs in ways not only to compensate for things that may not be available, but maybe to take advantage of opportunities, right? Maybe to find things that are special, that are unique, that are now available, that maybe we didn't think about, at some point in the future when we started the design.
Okay. All right. You also, in your in this week's newsletter that just went out, you also kind of pulled the supply chain discussion into another discussion with a couple other topics: sustainability, lean. How do you and lean? I'll sit on lean for just a second. So lean construction is a big buzzword in the industry. Has been for a couple years now. Sometimes we're a little behind the rest of the world in construction. That's just because we like to wait and see if it's going to work somewhere else. But clearly in the manufacturing sector, lean, whatever you want to call it, the Toyota way, lean productivity, lean manufacturing has worked and been very transformative. There's a lot of correlations about between lean goals and what we're trying to accomplish in construction, and so we're really seeing a lot more interest in lean principles ported over to construction. How does that impact the discussion?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you said it because we all stole lean from Toyota, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah.
Toyota developed this approach, and it's worth noting. I mean, the reason the what drove Toyota to create this very different philosophy about manufacturing was basically they were broke, right? They had to come up with
Yeah.
ways of being hyper efficient to survive.
Hmm.
And so that drove this innovation and really, like I say, a different philosophy around manufacturing that, you know, 30, 40, 50 years later is really becoming a revolution that the rest of us are still getting on board with.
Yeah.
Many people, right? And when you hear the word lean, many people assume, oh, this is a bunch of tricks for reducing the amount of inventory that we have. Um, but when you really get into it, what lean is about is improving the flow, right, through your supply chain. It's about, reducing sources of turbulence, reducing constraints, reducing obstacles, and making sure that everything flows smoothly, which, now we're sort of nostalgic about. That was the good old days, right, when stuff actually worked.
Yeah.
I'll mention I did unlock your lean construction course in
Nice.
my newsletter.
Okay,
So
great.
it's a great course. You've done a really fabulous job of taking those lean principles and translating it for the construction world. But if people want to watch it, they can go click in my newsletter and they can watch it for free.
Cool.
Um, so the but the thing I wanted to emphasize is lean isn't really about reducing inventory. Lean is about making things flow smoothly and consistently. One of the benefits is then you need less inventory because really, most of the time we have inventory as a hedge against uncertainty, as a hedge against risk, or we have inventory because we haven't done a good job of planning, of forecasting. And by adopting lean, you really connect the pieces of the supply chain more closely,
Okay.
eliminating things that you don't need, reducing lead times, improving communications. All of those things do help to reduce inventory. That's one of the benefits. But more importantly, they make you more adaptable. They help you to respond more quickly to the changes. And when we're in an environment like we're in now, where it's like, oh my goodness, we ran out of something. How do we make sure that our downstream supply chain, our downstream processes respond properly instead of making the problem worse? Well, that's where adopting lean really helps to be able to respond more quickly.
Okay. All right. Um, we're getting quite a few questions on here. So if and as a reminder to everybody watching, if you do have some questions, you can post those questions in the comments and we'll see them. Before we get to the question, go ahead, Daniel. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Jim, I can't see the questions, but that's fine. I trust you completely. But I do see that you're sharing the link. That is the link for my newsletter from last week, which is fine. I think that we talk about that anyway. I haven't featured the one from this week yet, but if you go to supplychain.com, that'll take you to whatever the latest newsletter is.
Perfect. All right, and I will throw that up there in a minute when I can type. But yeah, so supplychain.com.
That's right. It's the supply chain newsletter, and you just got to be careful because you start going down the rabbit hole, and pretty soon you see the supply chains everywhere. You become supply chained.
Yeah, I can imagine. I still can't get the whole semiconductor thing out of my head, and I've got Taiwan Semiconductor and some clients that are involved in that whole construction process, and a friend of mine that supplies rebar, and he's trying to figure out where to get 15,000 tons of rebar like right now, because that doesn't exist here in the States. So am I going to import it? Am I going to find another?
It's probably sitting on a ship in the Suez Canal right now.
Yeah, if it is, it's going to be a long time. You mentioned sustainability and how does that tie into this discussion?
Well, one of the big trends in the supply chain world is talking about circular economy and circular supply chains.
Okay.
And the phrase that I love that really helped make this click for me from my friend Deborah Dull is she said, if you want to think about what a circular economy means, it means everything is inventory. And you let that soak in, right? And so, we use the example of the lumber supply chain, right? Well, the lumber supply chain starts with trees. Trees depend on soil and space and climate and all those things. Well, in sort of traditional supply chain thinking, we kind of start with the tree and we end with a house, and that's the supply chain. With circular supply chains and really thinking about sustainability, then we'd ask the question, well, what happens to the house, right? Where does that go? That's inventory. What does that inventory get used for? And how do we keep everything in our supply chain at the highest value state for the longest time? How do we keep increasing the value at every step along the way? So that's one principle, is really, thinking about everything as inventory, trying to keep it at the highest value state for as long as possible. Another one, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, is, are there ways that we can create additional value, additional benefits from, for example, the materials that we use or the structures that we create by modifying the design? And so, for example, obviously, one of the big challenges that we're facing as a planet is global warming, which comes from carbon that we emit through our supply chain processes. And what is the most common building material in the world? Concrete.
Concrete, that's right.
Well, the way that we make concrete, we have to bake limestone. We use a huge amount of energy. We emit a lot of carbon in doing it.
To produce the cement. Yeah.
And to produce the cement. Thank you. And I do understand the difference between concrete and cement.
Yes,
and
I learned that you have actually done in your undergraduate, concrete, cement, and aggregate studies. So that was kind of cool to learn last week.
Alkali aggregate reactivity and fly ash is just a heck of a fun conversation. But so the question would be, okay, can we look at the concrete supply chain and do things to either reduce the amount of carbon that we're emitting, change the energy source, or are there things that we can do with the concrete design where it can actually absorb carbon later on in its life, right? And so the net effect of the carbon that we generate versus the carbon that it absorbs, they kind of offset. So, I mean, those are the sorts of innovations and really, places where I see construction and supply chain needing to collaborate in order to, achieve some of these higher level goals and sustainability objectives that really we need to be focused on to make sure that, the planet that we're living on is a nice place to hang out for a long time.
Yeah, that's pretty important, right?
Yeah, it seems like a big deal.
Yeah. Kamal had a comment here. The design, build, delivery mode allows designers to prevent such situations by collaborating with contractors early in the construction process. Kind of ties into what you're discussing, Daniel. And Kamal, you're right. Design, build, delivery methods allow that. Really, any of these, we used to call them alternative project delivery methods, when I was teaching at ASU a few years ago, and now they've become so common, I'm not sure alternative project delivery methods is the right term. And I started using the term early contractor engagement types of project delivery methods, whether it's design build, IPD, or integrated product delivery, CM at risk, any of these methods where the contractor, the general construction contractor, gets hired at the same time as the architect. So now we have the whole team working together. We have the owner, we have the architect and design team, and we have the actual entity that's going to build the facility, structure, bridge, building, whatever it is, all working together from day one to work through all of these processes, right? So now we've got an owner who's got a dream, right? This is what I want my thing that I'm going to spend all this money on to look like. And we have an architect who's trying to translate that dream into reality and coming up with, all these cool building materials and products and things like that. But, and in the past, it was always, that was it. That was the end of the conversation. When that conversation was over, there was a set of construction drawings generated and all the general contractors went to bid on it, and it was a race to the bottom kind of thing. Low bid gets it. And now we have really begun to change that methodology and bring that contractor in with those other two partners from the beginning, so that they can have these conversations about what is this building material selection do to you, the contractor, and what does its life cycle look like, and when its life cycle is over, what are we going to do with it? I think contractors are in a much better position to answer some of those questions and to help fill in this piece about the supply chain and hey, we're looking at 18 months down the road. Will we be able to get this? And so I think those have really helped the industry kind of move forward as well.
And Jim, I think, there's a really important point there, which is, the owner and the architect and the construction company are part of the same supply chain, right?
Yeah.
And they are depending on each other. And yes, every one of them is in business, to meet their own goals. And at some level, they're trying to get the best deal from, for themselves. But it's not the fault of the construction company that lumber prices are, in some cases 3 times what they were last year.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
they've got a margin baked in, and they probably have some room for contingency,
Mm-hmm.
but the owner and the architect need to, you've got to have a level of trust and transparency there to say, listen, this is out of everybody's control. And the question is, it's different than what we thought it was going to be when we had this conversation a year ago. We need to make decisions today based on what's happening around us. How do we all work together to do the best that we can, given the reality of the environment?
Well, yeah, and you mentioned contingencies and things like that, and that's been a really interesting discussion here recently as well, because even in these, one of the aspects of these early contractor engagement types of project delivery methods, where the general contractor is not hired based on price or low bid, because there's nothing to bid yet when they get hired. They're hired now just like the architect, based on reputation, capabilities, that type of thing, and then they're going to help during the pre-construction and design phase. Those are very open types of project delivery methods and arrangements, and they're very much suited towards bringing the best value to the owner, as opposed to bringing the lowest price to the owner. So it's this more open conversation of, I've got $25 million. How can I get the best building possible for $25 million? And there is always this contingency, usually this contingency factor built in. But as general contractors now, where we're being hired to be the experts during the design phase to ensure that there are no disruptions during construction, it's really important that we start taking this, I think, this whole supply chain discussion into account, because 18 months later, when we're in the construction phase and all of a sudden lumber, for example, costs 3 times as much, you've got an owner that's now going to be looking at you saying, why didn't you tell me about this? you told me there might be a little blip. You didn't tell me 3 times as much. And I don't have, as an owner, I don't have unlimited funds. I've got to continue, we place some money into contingency, but if you blow by that, it can really be a problem. I mean, if the owner doesn't have the money to continue, the owner doesn't have the money to continue. So we really, I think in the construction industry, particularly as we look at these early types of contractor engagement delivery methods, we got to become better at watching the supply chain and really looking out and predicting, what's going to happen during construction. I don't know. You have any comments on that?
Well, absolutely. And I'll tell you, one of the things that's interesting about this, so none of us has a crystal ball, right? Nobody can see the future. And who could have predicted that lumber prices would go up by a factor of 3, right? So on the one hand, there's a temptation to just go, well, who knows? What can you do? Yeah. One of the, in the supply chain world, we talk about that as risk management, right? How do you anticipate what are the things that could go wrong and what do you do about it? And I talk about it a lot in my book. I've got a whole chapter about supply chain risk management, but really one of the best approaches when you're facing big stakes, highly uncertain sorts of environments is to use a scenario planning approach, right? And it takes a little bit of imagination, but instead of trying to predict what the future is going to be, scenario planning means, well, let's think about different ways that the future could play out. And then how would we respond in each of those different scenarios? There is a really great toolkit for scenario planning that the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics put together for the Department of Transportation, I think. DOT was the funder for it. It's free. It's on the web. I've got a link in my book. I'm happy to share a link in the chat when we're done. But what they've done is, one, they created 4 different scenarios that you can use in a scenario planning exercise, right? So if there's an architect, an owner, or a construction company right now that says, hey, I want to try doing scenario planning, well, they can download that MIT toolkit and put together a workshop where they practice it. Okay. What you really need to do, though, is figure out for your business or for your project, what are the variables that really are important for you? What are sort of a range of scenarios across which those variables could change? And then have a plan, right? And that's a conversation that you can have with your customers and your suppliers to say, this is the range of scenarios that I think we need to deal with. What would you and I do if this happens? What would you and I do if this happens? Yeah. Because then when the future comes to play, you already know what you're going to do, right? You don't have to figure it out. You've already made that decision. You know what the response is going to be, and you can really work together to make it happen.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you brought that up because I attend, pre-pandemic, way pre-pandemic, I attended one of your in-person presentations when you were here in my state, and you and several others were sort of talking about this concept of supply chain management as a risk management exercise, and I think that like you just described, that really applies here as well. And Sam had a question. I don't know if you can see these, Daniel, so I'll read it. How much of a strategy exists in construction to develop strong relationships with key suppliers? This would allow for in-time accurate information of what's happening in the supply chain. I mean, do you think that's a good strategy for supply chain management, keeping an eye on the supply chain, developing? I can speak to how this is taking place in the construction industry, but from a supply chain management, what do you think the balance is there between developing real strong relationships with 1 or 2 key suppliers versus sort of diversifying amongst a lot of suppliers?
Sure. And shout out to Sam. And for folks that don't know, Sam is also a LinkedIn Learning instructor. And Sam focuses a lot on communication, right? And particularly, how do we view communication as a process so that we can apply lean tools and lean thinking to make our communication work better? So, general answer to that, in the supply chain world, procurement, purchasing is an important part of our supply chains.
Mhm.
And what we tend to do is segment our suppliers based on things like how much money we spend with them, or how critical, how unique their skills are, how much it would cost to switch to a different supplier for the same materials. I'll say in general, all of us have this attitude that the customer is always right. Right. And it translates into almost an arrogance of, hey, you're my supplier. You get your money from me. When I say jump, you say how high. Where that flips around really quickly is when you're in a situation like we are today, where materials aren't available, costs are going up. And all of a sudden, the suppliers can pick and choose how much they're going to allocate and how much they're going to charge and who they're going to sell it to. So overall, I think, yes, you need to figure out who your important suppliers are, but it isn't just based on how much you spend with them, right? And back to David Simshi-Levy, he did some research on this and really said, the thing that you need to figure out is how unique is a supplier, meaning how unique are their capabilities or the things that you buy from them, and how important are the things that you buy from them to your profitability, right?
Yeah.
And that isn't necessarily correlated to how much you spend with them, right? And so in the auto industry, for example, there are some really small niche suppliers who only sell a small quantity of parts that you have to make a pickup truck, right? Back to our semiconductors. So, from the standpoint of the auto manufacturers, semiconductors are not a big percentage of their spend, right? But all of a sudden, you can't buy an F-150 because of semiconductors. And by the way, that doesn't just have cascading effects to customers, right? Yes, you can't buy an F-150 now because of semiconductors. But what's happening to the companies that make fuel injection systems or that make fenders or that make paint? All of a sudden, their customers aren't buying their products anymore. And so those supply chains get jammed up, and that creates new bullwhip effects.
Okay. All right. This great stuff. We are kind of approaching our 1 hour mark. I've got one more question that I want to throw up here, and I know you can't see these in advance, so you're not getting to vote on whether or not I throw these questions up. So we'll see if you have an answer. Because I certainly don't. But the question here is, do you think we need more technology in supply chain based on artificial intelligence or data to monitor the supply, production, and demand in our local market or international market to help forecast issues? And I throw that up here because I talk a lot about technology in construction and adopting new technology. Are we looking at the same thing in supply chain?
We are, in different ways, right? But there's a ton of technology stuff that's really changing the way that we do supply chain. So, I talked at the beginning about supply chain is about people and processes and technology, right? Mm-hmm. And I would also say you can think about supply chains in terms of sort of 3 steps. There is planning, right? Trying to anticipate what the future is going to look like and be prepared for it. Then there's execution. What are we doing today based on the reality on the ground? And the third piece is visibility. Can I actually see what's happening? And those 3, typically in terms of computer systems, information systems in the supply chain, those are 3 different worlds, right? So you'd go one place to prepare your plans, do your forecasts, place your orders maybe with suppliers. Then you'd have another place where you're doing your manufacturing execution. And those systems didn't really need to talk because they were operating on different time scales.
Yeah.
And then you'd have your visibility, right? So maybe you'd have a dashboard that you'd pull up and, see where shipments were in the world and track them on a map or whatever. One of the big things that we're seeing in technology today is where those three are converging, right? Where you're planning in real time, which means, your execution is feeding right back in, and the visibility is key to making that happen. As those three converge, it becomes too much information and it's happening too fast for people to do it. And so we have to have artificial intelligence driving a lot of what's happening today in supply chains.
Okay, interesting. And that, I don't know, maybe that sort of answers. I had another question up here. How do you create a resilient supply chain rather than just reacting to what's happening? And in the last 3 minutes here, I don't know. Do you have any words of wisdom for creating a resilient supply chain?
Absolutely, and I've written a newsletter about it, so that helps, right? But we can go back and look at that newsletter. But what makes a supply chain resilient? A big part of it is being flexible, right? Being able to change. Part of it is, a lot of cases we just need buffers, right? We need a way to handle uncertainty, and so inventory can be a buffer. But there are other ways that you can buffer, like, you can use faster transportation modes, right? Have that as an option where you spend a little bit more to get something delivered faster. Having being able to share internally. So, an example that I'd use in construction is if you're a construction manager and you're running a couple of different jobs, having the flexibility to move material from one job to another if you need to compensate for a short-term disruption or interruption, or being able to move crews around, right? So being able to share resources is a way to make it resilient. The other thing that I'll say, though, real quick, and it gets back to this issue of the fabs in Arizona. There's this emerging idea in supply chains that it's not just about being resilient, but it's about being anti-fragile. So designing your supply chain in a way that it is less fragile. And that is, one of the issues with saying, hey, I'm going to manufacture this part on the other side of the planet, and then I've got to somehow get it where I'm going to consume it. Just on the surface, the cost of that may make sense and may justify it, but that it is fragile. And so if you're going to take advantage of the cost benefits of that, either you're accepting the risk and the fragility, or you need to design in ways that you're going to balance that risk with also having domestic production or some other alternative, or storing inventory. Okay.
All right. Great stuff. Really appreciate you joining me today, Daniel. Again, there's the link on the screen, supplychain.com, and that goes directly to Daniel's supply chain newsletter. It's weekly. Is that right?
It is weekly.
Yeah. So, that great source of information. Go there, check it out. That'll take you to LinkedIn. That'll take you to his newsletter. You can click on subscribe, and that way you get it in your inbox every week, as well as being able to see it in your LinkedIn feed. So supplychain.com. Again, thank you very, very much for joining me today. I think this has been a great discussion. We've had some great questions and comments. So I really, really appreciate it. Reminder to everybody, join me again next week. Same, Wednesday, 9 a.m. Pacific. I'll be broadcasting somehow live from World of Concrete, showing you what's new in the concrete industry and taking a look at the new Boring Company tunnel. I feel like if I shout out the Boring Company tunnel enough, maybe somebody from the Boring Company will show up and give me a tour. So that's, fingers crossed. We'll see what happens there. Other than that, again, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next week.